Good afternoon, and thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you, Matt and Anne-Marie in particular, for the opportunity to provide Ford's perspective on what is an amazing and exciting time for transportation in the U.S. Ford really believes that autonomous vehicles have significant potential to make a big difference in our world in terms of mobility and safety and congestion. But I want to underscore that this is a really complicated topic that we're talking about, and we have a lot of difficult tasks ahead of us. We're all learning together as we go, and it's really important that we have events like this where people can come together and learn from each other and understand the hard job that we have ahead of us. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what Ford is doing in particular. Our CEO, Mark Fields, announced last year that Ford intends to deploy an SAE Level 4 vehicle for a commercial application, meaning something like ride-hailing, ride-sharing, or perhaps package delivery service for use in a geofenced area in 2021, which seems like a ways away, but it's really right around the corner. That vehicle, which is going to be built at our Flat Rock assembly plant here in Michigan, won't have a steering wheel or an accelerator pedal or brake pedals. It's going to be completely controlled by a virtual driver. We currently are testing a number of autonomous vehicles in our development fleet here in Michigan on test tracks, where we create and control different environmental situations, as well as on public roads here in Michigan and also in Arizona and California. And we always use a trained safety driver, an engineer, and a spotter in each of our vehicles. But rather than have me talk in depth about what Ford's doing, I thought I would show you a couple of quick videos which are really great at demonstrating what our program is about. The first one is actually from about a year ago and is really talking about the research that we were focused on. And then the second video is from just the end of last year. So you can see sort of just in 1 year how far we progressed.
Even a lot of my friends don't realize how long Ford's been working in autonomy. I started out 10 years ago in the DARPA challenge days, and we've been working diligently and steadfastly that entire time trying to advance the technology.
Is this really possible? Is fully autonomous driving really possible? Because people have been talking about it since, the 50s. And it was always sort of a dream, but people were always saying, yeah, but it's going to be difficult for all these different reasons. A lot of the driving rules that expert drivers use, they're actually things that can be distilled into algorithms. We can make the autonomous vehicle have that knowledge. It can understand how to regain control of the vehicle in situations that a typical driver just wouldn't know because they haven't received that training.
In 2004, when DARPA conducted their first grand challenge, they asked for some industrial partners to come help them stage the show. In subsequent years, after having seen the first event, it became obvious to me that if you could make a car that was smart enough to drive itself, you could probably make a car that was smart enough to be a lot safer. And not only did we participate and reach the finals, but we also collaborated and partially supported two of the other finalists in the race.
Sensing is really key, and how you process that sensing to make decisions on where to go is really important for autonomy.
The holy grail in solving a problem of making a car drive itself is to have a 3D picture of the world around you. When we thought of making a better 3D picture of the world, what came to my mind was using laser scanners in the form of LiDAR. We could make a 3D picture at great fidelity out to hundreds of meters. It was a much more efficient way to directly measure distances to everything around you.
I think this is the most exciting challenge I've had in my career because this is an area that absolutely is in the forefront of everybody's mind right now. And it's just really fascinating to be working in an area that captures everybody's imagination. It's something everybody wants to talk about. Now, I think there's been a critical mass of engineering talent applied to this problem, and enough of the hard problems have been overcome that people are starting to say, wow, this looks like this is going to happen.
The autonomous vehicle platform we're developing can be applied to any of the products we make. Everything from a Focus all the way up to Super Duty. And that's really the power of Ford Motor Company in that We make a lot of vehicles, and we can bring this technology to a lot of people.
Just bear with me for one more video, just because I think they help really illustrate what's coming.
Ford will be mass producing vehicles with full autonomy within 5 years. And that means there'll be no steering wheel, no gas pedals, and no brake pedals. A driver is not going to be required. And in fact, we see autonomous vehicles as having as significant an impact on society as Ford's moving assembly line did more than 100 years ago. So when we step back and we take a look how we can make the most difference in people's lives during the next 100 years, we see the autonomous car changing the way the world moves again.
But hopefully you can see, from Ford's earlier announcement and also from the first video that we're really serious about deploying autonomous vehicles. But this isn't all just about solving a technical problem. There's also significant policy, legal, and societal questions that have to be worked through, which is why we're working collaboratively with major research institutions as well as federal and state regulatory bodies to contribute and benefit from a community of shared learning. We're also very serious about working with state and federal policymakers in order to establish a sensible legal and regulatory framework that ensures safety but also allows innovation to prosper. Having the right policy in place at the right time is a common goal of almost everyone, and we view that the right framework is uniform and nationally applicable. And we appreciate that NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, took a great step forward last year when it released its Federal Automated Vehicles Policy, the FAVP, if you haven't heard of it. And while that was tremendously helpful, it doesn't solve all of the statutory or legal impediments to autonomous vehicle testing and deployment. There are two federal policy actions that we view as critical. First, NHTSA needs to commence rulemaking to amend currently existing federal motor vehicle safety standards, or FMVSSs, if you're not familiar with those. And the problem with some of the existing FMVSSs is that they mandate human operator controls to allow automated driving systems. So you heard me talk about our plans for a level 4 vehicle that doesn't have a steering wheel, brake pedal, or accelerator pedal. Those might not be permitted under existing FMVSSs. Last year, NHTSA issued a couple of key documents. First, they had an interpretation to Google of a number of FMVSS requirements, and then Volpe Transportation Research Institute issued a report. And the conclusion of both of those documents put together is that there's agreement that highly automated vehicles without driver controls will have difficulty meeting those FMVSS requirements. Just to give you an example, FMVSS 135 relates to brake performance for service brakes and includes performance requirements, meaning you should stop in this amount of distance with this level of force at this speed. But there's also a requirement that brakes should be activated by means of a foot control. When Google did their interpretation, they described a design that didn't have a brake pedal. And NHTSA said that while they may be able to demonstrate that they meet the performance requirements of FMVSS 135, meaning they can stop within the required distance, that didn't overcome the plain language that requires a foot control, and therefore Google's described vehicle design would not comply with the regulation. Another example is FMVSS 111 that requires vehicles to display a rear view image to the vehicle operator. So most new vehicles that you start to see on the street today will have a rear camera so that you can see what's going on behind your car when you're in reverse. FMVSS 111 requires that camera display a particular image in the screen, And the way that they verify that is literally as simple as putting the car in reverse, looking at the screen, and making sure that cones that are placed behind the vehicle are visible to the driver. So NHTSA said with respect to 111, it was perfectly reasonable that a virtual driver could see the required image, but they had no way to test for that, because if you didn't have a screen displaying that required image, they had no way to know whether you met those requirements or not. And therefore, the test procedure for 111 would have to be rewritten. And I give you these as examples to demonstrate how some existing regulations at the federal level may be a bit of an inhibitor. Our second policy action that we see as necessary on the federal level would be to increase the statutory Safety Act exemption cap to permit higher volume autonomous vehicle deployment. So NHTSA has the ability to exempt manufacturer from requirements, including the requirements that I talked about, if a manufacturer can make a safety case for those vehicles or features. But that exemption is capped at 2,500 vehicles a year for a period of 2 years. So for a full-scale manufacturer at volume production, 5,000 vehicles over 2 years probably isn't high enough, so we'd like to see an increase in that cap. It's important to remember, though, that even in the absence of any specific requirements or any FMVSSs related to safety of autonomous vehicles, we're not in the wild, wild west. NHTSA still has significant authority over manufacturers. We have a legal obligation to produce vehicles that are safe for the general public, and we have significant recall obligation if our vehicles have a safety defect. So just because we don't have any particular FMVSSs directed at autonomous vehicles, that doesn't mean that we're not obligated to make safe vehicles. So in addition to these regulatory hurdles that I just mentioned, there are, of course, a number of other legal and policy questions that need to be sorted out. As the FAVP, or federal policy, points out, vehicles are subject to both state and federal regulation. For a long time, it's been accepted that NHTSA regulates vehicle performance or safety of vehicles, and states regulate drivers and safety of drivers. With the advent of automated vehicles, particularly level 4 and above, the vehicle in effect becomes the driver. And so it's understandably confusing to figure out how the division of responsibility of who regulates what should be sorted out among state and federal. In its AV policy, NHTSA asks states specifically to examine laws and regulations in areas like licensing and registration, driver enforcement, driver education and training, insurance and liability, enforcement of traffic laws, and administration of motor vehicle inspections if necessary. Unfortunately, many states are considering policy changes that go well beyond these traditional state roles, and the most concerning of these are those disparate vehicle testing and performance standards, which ultimately could hinder innovation. So we're truly grateful for the leadership that Michigan showed in passing the latest AV legislation that permits autonomous vehicle operations and deployment on the state's roads and is closely aligned with NHTSA's guidance in this area. NHTSA also charged states with identifying gaps in current regulations in a number of areas. There are two that I just want to highlight, and I'm not going to talk about them in depth. One of them is law enforcement and emergency response. There's some very important questions that have to be answered. How does an officer pull over a vehicle for a traffic stop if they need to issue a ticket? Will vehicles have the ability to disable vehicles if needed? How will first responders be able to access vehicles? And do the answers to any of these questions change when no one is in the vehicle? And what about if it's a minor child or someone with a disability? The second thing I want to just highlight is the need to look at data and what data will be available both for crash investigations and crash reporting. There's a sort of a lack of clarity about who is the driver in these situations, which I already mentioned. In the case of ride sharing or ride hailing applications, owner and operator will perhaps take on new meetings as well. So managing the availability of this data is going to be a new challenge. In summary, We have over 100 years of rules developed at various levels of government that are applicable to human drivers. And it's not always easy to apply the insight and knowledge developed in that 100+ years to what's coming. Humans and virtual drivers are not necessarily the same. But I think here in Southeast Michigan, home to the U.S. auto industry, we have a unique concentration of expertise, interest, and activity in working on these technologies and solving these questions. And I think by working collaboratively, we can definitely do it. Thank you.